An overview of US foreign policy, or US power. And just to remind you, I ended the discussion last night by saying that however powerful the United States still is, and in my regard is going to remain, I think it's going to remain the only superpower in the world. I don't think China or anyone else is going to overtake it in any real sense. We're still going to live in a world in which the United States is going to be a major and dominant player. The question is how effective it will be as a power. The question then is not how much power does it have, but how effective its power is. And my conclusion really is don't underestimate the United States. The truth of the matter is that you're never going to solve any problem in the world without the United States. And it's still the United States which plays a key role in the world. I also ended last night on thinking about certain challenges that are facing the United States in US foreign policy. And the three challenges I identified at the end of my lecture, which was a little bit too long, was firstly that the United States has been dealing with a long-term problem of what exactly is its mission, what exactly is its purpose. And during the Cold War, it had a very clear mission, a very clear purpose, which was communism, fighting the USSR, and to some degree communist China. Now that is no longer there, and some of the difficulties of understanding American foreign policy, it seems to me, is largely to do with the very fact of the end of the Cold War itself. This, if you like, has no enemy, and nothing has replaced the Soviet Union really in any. So the world, it's become more messy, it's become more complicated world. It's not such a simple world as it once was. The second challenge I identified, just to remind you again, is that domestically there is now much more division in the United States. There's little consensus on a number of key issues, moral issues and social issues and policy issues. We have a president who is a liberal, possibly even social democratic, you might say. You could see Obama very easily inside Tony Blair's, Labour Party. And on the other side, Republicans are, over on the very conservative wing of the debate about politics. As we can see the success of Donald Trump, who I mentioned last night as well. So really what you've got is really quite a divided country, and it's difficult then to create consensus internally about what America should be doing externally, I think. And the third challenge I identified, just to remind you, just to introduce us to this morning's debate, is that the world is a much more complicated place, I think. It doesn't make it more dangerous, but it is more complicated. And I think that complexity, there's no easy answer to any foreign policy question. I mean, take Syria, what do you do? What to do about Russia? How to deal with China? What to do about climate change? What to do about terrorism? All these things, there are no easy answers, and it's very easy to think, well, there is an easy answer. The Americans are stupid. Why can't they come up with a straightforward answer? Well, it's never that easy. The one thing Americans have found out over the last 20, 15 years is that they can't do it by themselves. If you like, there's a lesson that's been learned over the last 15 years. It is the United States can't achieve anything by itself. It has to have allies, it has to have partners. And in that way, if we think of it in that term, that one of the great challenges for the United States is how to work out its partners, how to work with others to achieve anything, because it cannot achieve it by itself. And that is one of the major lessons from the Bush years. Unilateralism does not work. Yeah? Then the question is who or which countries are really its partners? And the obvious answer, and it's the answer that's been here for a long time, is the Europeans. You know, if one looks around the world, in terms of America's long-term partnerships, long-term allies, the fundamentally important series of alliances, partners, if you wish, that the United States has in the world today are the Europeans. Now, that doesn't mean to say it doesn't have, partnerships in Africa, which it does, say with Ethiopia or South Africa. It doesn't mean to say that it doesn't have allies or partners in Asia. It clearly does. Japan, Singapore. It clearly has partnerships in South America. And it also has a partnership in the shape of Canada to the north. So it's not to deny other relationships. In the end, of course, the United States is a global power, and as a global power, it has interests everywhere. And therefore, it has alliances everywhere, South America, Africa, Asia, etc. But what I want to stress, I suppose, is why it is that the relationship with the Europeans is so important. What makes it so important? And will it continue to be important? That's seems to me the key question. Now, there's been a discussion over the last few years again that in some ways the transatlantic relationship, the relationship of the United States, particularly with the Europeans, has become less important. That's been a kind of increasing, you keep hearing this. And one of the reasons for that, people say, is the Americans are tilting to Asia. Americans are looking more and more towards Asia. Asia will be the future. Asia has the growth. Asia has a series of dynamic economies and stable partnerships, say with Japan or with Taiwan, Singapore. And moreover, Asia contains one of the great challenges for US foreign policy into the 21st century. And one of the great challenges for the United States into the 21st century clearly is going to be China, which is an Asian power. Moreover, over the last few years, and maybe over the last 20 years, you've seen an increasing interest of the United States in India. During the Cold War, the United States and India did not have good relations. But since the end of the Cold War and India's economic reforms, which began in the late 80s, early 1990s, as India has adopted more market reforms, in the post-Cold War environment, US-Indian relations have improved, that's to say with another Asian country. And there is a kind of feeling out there, and it goes back really to the beginning of the Obama presidency, that in some ways this president, Obama in particular, has been much more interested in what's going on in Asia than in Europe. That events in Asia and economic developments in Asia mean that Asia is the future, and if you like, Europe is the past. If you like, Europe is history, and Asia is the future. And with the new emerging powers such as China and India, and the dynamic Asian region, which by 2050 will be even more significant in the world economy than it is today, There's a kind of sense that the United States is, in a sense, losing interest in Europe, or it doesn't prioritize Europe to anything like the same extent. It's less interested in Europe, in other words. That's been a dominant theme over the last few years, and particularly under the Obama administration. What has also added to this, of course, is President Obama himself. His father is African. He lived some part of his early life in Indonesia. There's a kind of sense that he's a different kind of president in terms of his interests. He's not naturally European. I mean, the very fact that he's black means that he doesn't have that, natural, if you want to call it that, sense that there's an identity between, a white president and white Europeans. And therefore, that Obama would be a different kind of president with a different way of looking at the world because of his own history, coming from what he did. And his name, of course, was Barack Hussein Obama, so became that name. So it's not a classically European name. So there was always a belief that Obama didn't have the, what you might call the cultural connection with Europeans. And the other thing which came up with the Obama administration, or at least with the president himself, of course, that his father, as you know, was Kenyan, came from Kenya. And his father could remember the British in Kenya in the days of before Jomo Kenyatta became the first president of Kenya. I also point out, by the way, Jomo Kenyatta also studied at the LSE in the 1930s. Just, it was like bringing in that LSE point. He studied anthropology, in fact, at LSE in the 1930s. Later was put in prison by the British, of course, and then became the first president of Kenya. A remarkable and interesting man, a Kikuyu. Anyway, and this sense was, Kenya had lived under British colonial rule. Kenya went through a rather bloody period before independence. The British were not always nice, to put it simply. And Obama carried memories through his father of what had happened under the British, and therefore he wasn't so easily seduced, if you wish, by the British way of life. This kind of special relation. He didn't feel any special relationship with Britain, which a lot of previous presidents had, by the way. But when they thought of Europe, many of them tended to think of Britain as part of this kind of thing. I mean, George W. Bush. You could think the British are good guys. And Clinton liked Britain. He liked Europe generally, but he liked Britain. And if you go back even further to the Cold War, there was this special relationship with Britain. Britain and America had stood together in World War II, World War I, during the Cold War. But I don't think, the argument then was that Obama didn't have that sense of that natural relationship with the British and with Britain, and particularly given Britain's colonial past and the fact that his father came from Kenya, and therefore had memories of Kenyan independence struggles against the British. And there was a very funny story, I don't know if you knew this story, in the United States, the most popular foreign politician has always, for the last 50 years, has been Winston Churchill. There's almost a cult of Churchill in America. If ever you want to say something, you say, as Churchill said. There was always this kind of, as Winston Churchill, the great Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, by the way, was half American. So that made it easier, because his mother was American. So he was Anglo-American. And he was a great believer in the special relationship. And there's a big cult of Churchill in America still today. You don't criticize Churchill in the United States. It's easier if you're in Britain. You can criticize Churchill as much as you like, but not in America. And there was a big, apparently there was a very large bust, a statue of Churchill in the White House. I think even in the Oval Office, there's Churchill sitting there looking at you. And Obama said, let's remove that bust of Winston Churchill. And people again took this as indication of of a kind of lack of interest in the British. And therefore, by implication, a kind of lack of interest in Europe, in European affairs. And a number of things happened in the first few weeks and months of the Obama administration, which indicated that Obama's interest lay somewhere else. You know, they lay in Asia. They lay about China. He was more interested in the rising powers, you know, of Asia, India, China. More interested in Asian economic development than he was in Europe and European or British affairs. This is, again, quite paradoxical for one reason. When Obama became president, he became immediately very popular in Europe. No, if I take you back to 2007, 2006, 2005, I'll take you back to the Bush years. Can you remember them? George W. Bush. Can anybody remember George W. Bush now? I'm not sure we can. George W. Bush became very, very unpopular in Europe because of the Iraq War and because of the war on terror. I mean, he became very unpopular, particularly in Western Europe. A little less unpopular in Central and Eastern Europe for different reasons to do with Polish history and Czechoslovak, Hungarian history being different. And so therefore there was a real decline in popularity in Europe about America. There was anti-Americanism, it was quite strong. Anti-Americanism did become quite strong in Europe, Western Europe particularly, during the Bush years. As soon as Obama was elected, the popularity of the United States shot up straight away. People call it the Obama bounce, the bounce of Obama. As soon as Obama was elected, not only was Obama popular, America became popular again, or more popular than it had been. Anti-Americanism went down, feelings against the United States declined, etc. And during the Bush years, it had become very, very, very critical because of Bush. Now you had this intelligent, sophisticated, intellectual, in the shape of President Obama, more of a college professor than anything else. And this created an enormous degree of positive feeling in Europe towards Obama. And because I said last night, the president is the United States. You know, he becomes the symbol, he becomes the fundamental, he becomes America. And because Bush had been so unpopular, America became unpopular. Anti-Americanism rose during those Bush years. And so with the new president elected in 2008, and then taking over the White House in January 2009, attitudes towards the United States became altogether more positive. I call it a paradox for a very simple reason, because as America becomes more popular in Europe, as the President of the United States becomes more popular in Europe after the Bush years, it seems that America becomes less interested in Europe. It's a kind of strange two-way problem. One, America becomes more popular, and because of Obama's election, I think largely. But at the same time, if America becomes more popular, Americans, or America, seems to be looking towards Asia and becoming less interested in European affairs, maybe more interested in Asia. So what I want to argue here this morning with you really is to suggest that in spite of all that, in spite of America's tilt to Asia, America's increasing interest in China, its increasing focus on India, or its increasing focus on the dynamic economies of the Asia region, including Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, and all the rest. This does not mean, and this is what I want to emphasize here this morning, it does not mean, in spite of what some people might think, it certainly does not mean that the United States is losing interest in Europe. I mean, that's the bottom line. The tilt to Asia, so-called, the movement of taking more interest in Asia, it was not a tilt away from Europe, I don't think. I think there was misunderstanding on both sides.